How many of you watch or read the news? Have any of you noticed any racial bias or discrimination towards African Americans? Even if you have not consciously noticed, African Americans are commonly portrayed as impoverished or criminals through televised and magazine news. This is creating inaccurate and negative stereotypes affecting the public's opinion of African Americans.
Hi everyone, today I'm going to talk to you about poverty in the news. Through televised and magazine news, African Americans are portrayed as impoverished people. I have found research from 1950 to 1992 on this topic. The news networks CBS, NBC, and ABC were studied by members of the Oxford Press from 1988 to 1992. During these years, 534 stories on poverty appeared. 65.2% of these stories were solely focused on African Americans. However, during this time, only 29% of impoverished people in the United States were African American. Comparing these two numbers, 65.2 to 29%, clearly 65% is more than double the amount of actual African Americans in poverty. These newscasts strongly exaggerate the amount of African Americans in poverty, creating negative and inaccurate stereotypes. News magazines were also researched to see if the same fallacies could be found there as well. From 1950 to 1992, Time, Newsweek, and U.S. and World Report were searched for stories on poverty. 1,256 relative stories were found. In these stories, 53.4% of the pictures used showed African Americans. Again, during this time, only 29% of people in poverty in the United States were African Americans. The number of stories on African Americans is extremely overemphasized. Additionally, if 560 people were chosen from the impoverished people in the United States, approximately 162 would be expected to be African American. However, if 560 impoverished people were chosen from news magazines, approximately 345 would be expected to be African American. It is clear that African Americans are overrepresented as people in poverty through televised and magazine news. Additionally, these stereotypes have occurred in newscasts and magazines for a very long period of time, creating a negative and long-lasting stereotype of African Americans that is now becoming a social norm.
In connection, we wanted to also look at another portrayal of African Americans, not as impoverished people, but as criminals. On news programs and reality television, African Americans are often inaccurately criminalized. They are generally depicted to be the majority of American criminals or suspects, despite the reality of statistics relating to arrests and incarcerations in the U.S. today. First, we'll examine news broadcasting. Findings and studies from the last 2 decades concerning racism on broadcast news show that African Americans, when featured in these programs, were almost always depicted as dangerous, unkept, or intelligent criminals. Though there are suspects and criminals who may be this way, consistently broadcasting that type of image to a large viewer base creates negative African American stereotypes, such that they always hold these negative attributes. These generalizations are inaccurate. In a 6-month study of local news broadcasts in 1992, findings showed that cases about African American criminals or suspects relating to both violent and nonviolent crime made up 84% of these news stories. African American criminals portrayed often looked disheveled or were handcuffed. These portrayals of African Americans often carry subliminally inaccurate information by consistently showing them as aggressive or impoverished, leading to the creation and reinforcement of negative stereotypes. Now, let's move on to reality television. Recent studies findings suggest that in shows like Cops or America's Most Wanted, 77% of African Americans were portrayed as either suspects or criminals only. Because police officers in these programs use violence or aggression more often towards African Americans than towards whites, the African American criminals were depicted as being even more dangerous. On the contrary, in an FBI crime report in 2012, arrests of white criminals made up 69.3%, while African American criminals arrests only made up 28.1%. With those statistics as evidence, broadcasting African Americans consistently as criminals who, in these media depictions, are arrested majorly more often than whites is extremely inaccurate. These portrayals, conveying the idea that African Americans are always criminals, is unrealistic. Unfortunately, it is these programs that produce negative portrayals of African Americans, creating stereotypes which are often adopted by program viewers.
A big part of how African Americans and other minorities are shown through media is how the viewing public receives it and what they gain from it, whether it is subconscious or conscious. In the early 2000s, a study was done where researchers called people over the phone in Los Angeles, a very diversely populated location. The researchers asked the people what news they watched and how much of it they watched. Next, they were asked to estimate the average annual income of African Americans. The results showed that people who watched more network news estimated much lower incomes for African Americans than those who didn't. This shows that because African Americans are displayed as people in poverty on network news, the public believes these inaccurate stereotypes to be the reality. In 1987, in a very different society, another similar study was done. White people were shown a news story about a white person in poverty, and others were shown a story with an African American in poverty. After watching these stories, the participants were asked what the top 3 issues facing the nation were. 71% of the people who watched the story about a white person in poverty said that poverty was a major issue, while 53% of the people who were shown a story of an African American in poverty included poverty as an issue. This displays that the media portrays African Americans in poverty far too often. Clearly, people still to this day falsely associate African Americans with poverty as much as they did 30 years ago. Also, in that same study done over the phone in Los Angeles, people were asked about African American stereotypes such as criminalization. People with more exposure with more stereotypical and biased views. The portrayal of African Americans in the news has made society have more racist views.
The news media is portraying African Americans as people who are impoverished and as criminals. Even though some African Americans are, the news media makes it seem as though all of them fall under these categories. This is creating negative and inaccurate stereotypes of African Americans that the public believes.